So a very warm welcome to all of you. Great to see you all again. By now it has somehow become familiar to see all of you every day and to listen to Nancy's fantastic lectures on those evenings. These have been wonderful and inspiring days, and I could go on like this forever. But actually today's lecture is the final lecture in this three-part series of lectures, the great finale, so we'll find out who the murderer is tonight. Taking her clue from Du Bois' canonical black reconstruction, Nancy has in her first lecture laid out the structural connection between three kinds of labor: exploited, expropriated, and domesticated labor. She has argued that capitalism is and remains dependent on all three of them for systemic reasons, and has thus offered an understanding of the respective struggles on issues of race, class, and gender as different kinds of labor struggles, struggles that need to be united. In the second lecture, she has turned from structure to history, following the twisted history of labor and labor movements under the changing regimes of capitalist appropriation. Today, we are arriving in the present. We will hear about contemporary financialized capitalism and the way this regime structures the relations between race, class, and gender, and we will hear what we can do about it. Today's lecture is titled Class Beyond Class, Toward a Counter-Hegemonic Politics. And as the last two evenings, once more, we will have 1 hour of lecture followed by a Q&A. So the floor is open. We are in great suspense.
Thanks again to Rahel, to Robin, to the whole team at the center and here at this wonderful place. And thanks again to the interpreters, and I want to apologize publicly to them for giving them this text so late, because I'm still working it, and I think they're going to have a tough job, but I know they're up to it. Okay, my aim in these lectures has been and still is to develop a perspective that can foster a coordinated emancipatory response to the present crisis. As I see it, this is a general crisis of our social order. General because it encompasses every major sector of society, not just the economy or just the family, not just nature or the state, but all of them, mutually entwined and mutually exacerbating. It's also a systemic crisis. Systemic because the impasses entangled in it are not accidental. They are structurally grounded in our social order, especially in capital's hunger for cheap labor, cheap energy, compliant states, free or very cheap childcare. I'm sorry, care work more generally, I meant to say. Finally, the crisis is hegemonic because decades of ongoing societal dysfunction have eaten away at our shared common sense, releasing a confused jumble of claims and counterclaims, some potentially emancipatory, others decidedly not. The result is we do not share an account of where our problems come from or of what could possibly count as a solution to them. Social conflict proliferates but does not accumulate. Dispersed and fragmented, it does not converge on a project that could transform society and resolve the crisis. We are stranded, to use Antonio Gramsci's term, in an interregnum. In this situation, one task of critical theory is to foster what the young Marx called the self-clarification of the struggles and wishes of the age. This task is at once intellectual and practical. At one level, critical theory must construct a diagnosis of our situation, disclosing the socio-historical roots of the crisis and determining what must be changed in order to resolve it. At another level, it must identify the social forces, the groups, movements, parties, and other organizations that could, in theory at least, endorse a shared emancipatory project of societal transformation, and that could conceivably come together in a counter-hegemonic bloc with the heft and vision to realize it. There is now, I think, a growing sense of the need for this sort of critical theorizing. After a period concentrated on single-issue identity siloed politics on the one hand, and on ahistorical armchair theorizing on the other, many are now seeking larger frameworks that can connect the dispersed struggles, those at least that can be counted as potentially emancipatory. The paradigm of intersectionality, I noted on the first night, hugely popular among feminists and anti-racists, is one important marker of this aspiration. Others, which I also mentioned, include the reemergence of social reproduction feminism, of racial capitalism theory, of eco-Marxism, and of democratic socialism. All these and more betoken a growing desire for integrative thinking and practice. The hunger for a counter-hegemonic perspective and for a counter-hegemonic bloc that could embody it is palpably in the air. Now, it's been my aim in these lectures to make a contribution of sorts to this integrative project. My contribution explores one possible basis for a counter-hegemony. The core idea, as Rahel already noted, is inspired by W.E.B. Du Bois's 1935 account in Black Reconstruction of what he called two labor movements, trade unionism and anti-slavery, each representing a distinct face of capitalist labor, the first exploited, the second expropriated. Two movements that should have, Du Bois claimed, but didn't, join forces. Now, in the previous lecture, I took up Du Bois' idea and expanded it. Drawing on feminist insights, I suggested we view feminism as a third labor movement that represents a third major face of capitalist labor, namely domesticated care work. A movement that now should join forces with the other two labor movements. The desideratum, then, is a common front of three labor movements in Du Bois's sense, movements mutually recognized, represented, and empowered. I'm going to call this idea tonight for short, Du Bois plus one. In the previous lectures, I've developed this Du Bois plus one proposal in two different registers, which complement and reinforce one another. Here I'm recapping actually what Rahel just told you. In lecture one, I offered conceptual and structural arguments for the claim that capitalist societies rely on three analytically distinct but mutually imbricated faces of labor: exploited, expropriated, and domesticated, and that the nexus of these three faces constitutes the hidden ties among gender, race, and class. In lecture two, I offered some historical reflections on the relations among those three faces of labor and among the three social movements associated with them: trade unionism, feminism, and anti-racism, anti-imperialism. Examining three previous periods of capitalist development, I tried to disclose both the inextricability of the three faces and the forms of misrecognition that have divided those who perform them. So what are our prospects today for overcoming such misrecognition and successfully pursuing the idea of Du Bois plus one? To answer this question, I want to return briefly to the history I sketched yesterday before turning to the present. Exactly how and why did the project of Du Bois plus one fail in earlier phases of capitalism? In the mercantilist regime of the 16th through 18th centuries, the question could not even arise. As we saw, there was plenty of expropriated subwork, but virtually no exploited labor in Marx's sense, nor any domesticated labor in my sense, labor enclaved in a separate sphere and not recognized as labor. Rather, the three types of labor were barely distinguished, let alone institutionally separated from one another. In the absence of their demarcation, the idea of three distinct labor movements, let alone an alliance among them, was not really conceivable. Matters were different, however, in the following era. Spanning the long 19th century, liberal colonial capitalism created large-scale exploited industrial labor, which it distinguished sharply, both politically and economically, from expropriated labor. As Du Bois noted, this regime imbricated those two faces of labor in a single system of production for the world market, even as it separated them from one another by a global color line. Consequently, each type of work gave rise to its own labor movement, anti-slavery on the one hand, trade unionism on the other. But only the second was recognized as a labor movement, and the alliance Du Bois envisioned failed to materialize. At this stage, moreover, domestication was not fully ripe for inclusion in such an alliance. Only beginning to emerge as a distinct face, it was not widely recognized as a fundamental form of capitalist labor, which could provide the basis for a third labor movement. Feminism erupted in this era, to be sure, but it rarely, if at all, took the form of a labor movement, even recognized as such by its own participants. So in this era, too, the project of Du Bois plus one was somehow historically premature. By contrast, state-managed capitalism really did generate the tripartite labor nexus in an overt, full-blown form. In this era, which spanned the middle third of the 20th century, exploited workers in the capitalist core, or in the wealthy countries of the core, won something close to a family wage, enabling housewifization for some working-class women. Their unpaid domesticated labor, those women's unpaid domesticated labor, was part of a larger pool of social reproductive work, which also included the low-wage and deeply disrespected amalgam of care work and subwork performed by racialized women. It also included some better-paid state-organized social service work performed by more privileged women. Subwork continued in both periphery and core, of course, and those who performed it remained a racialized caste, within the world system. In state-managed capitalism, then, the project of Du Bois plus one was at least conceivable, and yet it wasn't realized. If we can figure out why not, we might be able to better clarify our chances for realizing it now. Yesterday, I suggested that state-managed capitalism generated two revolutionary moments. The first, in the 1930s, marked the birth pangs of the regime. The second, in the 1960s and 70s, marked what turned out to be its death throes. The massive upsurge of the 1930s featured a labor coalition that was centered on the exploited face of capitalist labor. Certainly, that coalition was supported by labor's other two faces, but it did not give a prominent place to their conditions. Most of the gains that accrued to workers as opposed to capital went to the exploited. The domesticated and expropriated benefited too, but their gains came as side effects, consequence on the gains of the exploited, not usually one in their own names. Nevertheless, this exploitation-centered coalition consolidated social democracy in the core, while another coalition in the periphery, centered on expropriation, fought for independence and eventually established developmental states in the post-colonies. Both those forms of state-managed capitalism were framed nationally, as were the labor movements that built and powered them. But far from negating the idea of a capitalist world system, this national framing was the specific form in which the global system was organized in this period. The resulting regime of state-managed capitalism was neither deeply egalitarian nor fully inclusive, even within the terms of the national frame, let alone globally. But it was nevertheless an arrangement that expressed the aspirations of the labor movements that had fought for it. They could recognize themselves in it and claim it as an outcome of their agency. They could see its defects as their unfinished business, which demanded their ongoing efforts to reform it. In this respect, the regime's other revolutionary moment was entirely different. The 1960s and 70s featured a labor coalition of sorts, one that was centered on anti-racism and anti-sexism, thus on the expropriated and domesticated faces of capitalist labor. It actually had not much support from exploited labor, and indeed in some cases, it incurred the latter's outright hostility. As major beneficiaries of the state-managed regime, exploited workers absorbed and embraced its national framing. Viewing themselves as national citizen workers, they failed to see what they might gain from a global working class front that also encompassed the expropriated and the domesticated. Neoliberalism would reveal that soon enough. And indeed, that's the point. Unlike its 1930s predecessor, the labor coalition of the 1960s and 70s did not establish or consolidate a new regime in which it could recognize its aspirations. Quite the contrary. The regime that resulted expressed the aspirations of global capital, of big oil, big pharma, big agri, big arms, big finance, and now today, big data. The globalism that triumphed was theirs, not that of expropriated and domesticated labor. Certainly, the labor coalition of the 60s and 70s did not intend this result. But we can see with the benefit of hindsight that it served as a subsidiary demolition force, which helped weaken the state-managed regime and which converged with and was overtaken by the more powerful demolition forces of neoliberalization and financialization, which brings us finally to the present. Today's capitalism is neoliberal, financialized, globalized. It rests on a new configuration of labor's three faces, and it poses a new set of political puzzles as to whether and how those faces of labor can join together in an inclusive, global, pro-working class, counter-hegemonic front. The neoliberal regime's chief characteristics are now familiar. First, a huge expansion of expropriation, now fueled not only by in-your-face violence, but also and especially by debt. There is first the astronomical sovereign debt forced on post-colonial and semi-peripheral states by international lenders and financial institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. This debt is subject to repeated bouts of so-called structural adjustment, which do not reduce the sums owed, but rather send them soaring while lengthening the time frame for their repayment. What goes with this debt, moreover, is what is euphemistically called austerity, as creditors demand that state revenue be redirected away from social services and to interest payments. The result is to condemn not only existing post-colonial workers, but also their descendants to massive expropriation through skyrocketing debt service obligations and through public service retrenchments that reduce the social wage. But that is not all. There is also the spiraling debt of peasants compelled to buy newly engineered inputs, such as the notorious Terminator seeds developed by Monsanto. That debt leads to ongoing land dispossession and to waves of peasant suicide. And finally, there is ballooning consumer debt, especially in the historic core, where, déjà vu, wages have fallen below living costs, driving workers to max out their credit cards, mortgage their homes, eat into their pensions, take out car loans, buy their furniture and appliances on layaway, take out payday loans, and see their children entrapped in levels of student debt that will stunt their lives for many decades, if not forever. Thus, unlike the exploited workers Marx envisioned in Das Kapital, neoliberalism's workers live not off present wages, but off the promise of future wages, which may or may not materialize. These workers include not only capitalism's traditional subjects of expropriation, namely racialized subworkers, but also those who had previously succeeded in ridding themselves of it, namely the once merely exploited workers of Fordist industry. Expropriation through debt is thus a hallmark of the present regime, where it combines with other expropriative mechanisms, some old, such as corporate land grabs, some new, such as green grabbing, meaning public confiscation of indigenous and peasant lands in the name of environmentalism. A phony environmentalism, it must be added. All told, neoliberal financialized capitalism raises the share contributed by expropriation to capitalist profit vis-a-vis the share contributed by exploitation. This regime also universalizes expropriation, extending it to virtually the whole global working class. It invents new mechanisms, such as microcredit and subprime loans, that expand the population that qualifies for credit at one end of the spectrum, and also expands the population who cannot live without credit at the other end. Through debt, in other words, this regime stitches a thread of perverse commonality through the many folds of the global working class. The regime has also transformed the geography of capitalist labor, relocating much manufacturing to the semi-periphery and to the BRICS countries. It has scrambled landscapes once reserved almost entirely for the expropriated, now cultivating in them new hybrids, factory workers who are exploited and expropriated simultaneously. The landscape of labor in the historic core has shifted as well. There, shuttered, rusted factories litter spaces once populated by unionized workers, now ravaged by opioid addiction, gun violence, and suicide. What replaces the vanished jobs that once paid a family wage are low-wage, precarious MIC jobs, service work in retail, distribution, and for-profit care institutions like nursing homes, which don't actually care for anyone but merely warehouse people. These jobs are held disproportionately by women and people of color, including migrants. Next comes proliferating gig work, some freelance, as in the blogosphere and the new forms of the culture industry, some self-capitalizing, as in Uber, Airbnb, and influencing. Supposedly temporary placeholders for youth, these jobs show every sign of being long-lasting. And of course, at last, there are the prisons, warehouses for a large portion of the reserved army of racialized subworkers. If the return of expropriated subwork is somehow déjà vu too, so are the strains it inflicts on social reproduction. The mechanisms are new, however. Today, capital is hungry for women's waged labor. Hungrier than ever before, it recruits women massively into employment. The end of the family wage spells the rise of the two-earner family, so-called. And that is no feminist idol. What it means, rather, is that the wage of one household member can no longer support a family. Increased hours of paid work per household are required to keep it afloat. Hence the explosion of moonlighting, overtime, and bricolage, piecing together a living from lots of little jobs. Now add the retrenchment of public services, which shifts care work back onto families, especially women. The result is not just what the press calls a care crunch, but an all-out assault by capital on social reproduction. This, then, is the new landscape of labor in financialized capitalism. It is plainly, in a word, disastrous, but it is also part and parcel of a general crisis of our social order, as I mentioned before, a crisis of livelihood, work, and care, to be sure, but one entwined with crises of politics and ecology. A crisis so severe and all-encompassing that it demands a massive coordinated response. Is the current landscape of social struggle sufficient to meet it? The answer presumed in these lectures is no, or at least not yet, but perhaps it could become so in the future. As I noted at the start of lecture one, there's an obvious mismatch between the scale of emancipatory engagement on the one hand and that of the present crisis on the other. Emancipatory engagement is plentiful and potentially powerful, encompassing feminism, anti-racism, anti-imperialism, as well as new energies in union movements and in migrant rights movements, struggles for social equality and livelihood security, for democracy and ecological sustainability, for peace and human rights. But again, those forces are fragmented and dispersed. They neither coalesce around a shared project nor constitute a counter-hegemony. Nowhere in sight is there an emancipatory coalition of sufficient heft and vision to constitute a credible response to the present crisis. Some members, or potential members, of such an alliance or such a counter-hegemonic bloc have drifted to one or another unfortunate poles, to corporate neoliberalism on the one hand or to reactionary populism on the other. Some feminists and anti-racists have joined with neoliberals, establishing themselves as junior partners in a political bloc that I've called progressive neoliberalism. Embracing market-friendly paradigms to promote the meritocratic advancement of the few, they seek to crack the glass ceiling and to install black faces in high places. Meanwhile, other potential allies from traditional working class communities have joined with reactionary populists. Mesmerized by libidinally expressive, taboo-breaking showmen, they blame their own declining forces on an ever-changing cast of scapegoats, from racialized migrants and minorities to Muslims and Jews. My proposal is to try to split those two formations, progressive neoliberalism and reactionary populism, by forming a third bloc that could attract at least some of them, while also better integrating existing emancipatory forces that are now dispersed. That's the strategy behind the project of Du Bois +1. The idea is to invite feminists, anti-racists, and trade unionists to see themselves and one another as fellow labor movements, hence as members of an expanded working class. This understanding of the working class is not abstractly universal, but internally differentiated, comprising domesticated and expropriated workers as well as exploited workers, but also all those hybrid workers who are now the vast majority. Now, this proposal raises the question of an emancipatory subject. For me, the issue is how best to woo potential participants into an emerging counter-hegemonic bloc with an emancipatory project. Everything I've said to this point implies that the project must be anti-capitalist in an expanded sense, because struggles over exploitation and expropriation, domestication and expropriation, are just as deeply grounded in capitalist society as struggles over exploitation. An emancipatory bloc must articulate the concerns of feminists, anti-racists, and anti-imperialists with one another, and with those of whatever we might still think of as traditional labor movements, as well, as we'll see, as with those of environmentalists and radical Democrats. But that still leaves the question of how to interpolate the relevant actors. What mode of subjective address would best invite them to embrace that understanding and fight for that project? It seems to me there are two possibilities. The first gives up the idea of a single agent of emancipation. In lieu of an overarching subject that simply subsumes the bloc's various constituents, it envisions an alliance of multiple agents whose primary concerns differ, but are rooted nevertheless in one and the same social system, which none of them can change on their own. What unites them then is not a common subject position, but a shared understanding of capitalist society as the deep source of their various troubles and as their common enemy. That diagnosis underpins solidarity and motivates cooperation. Now, this view has some obvious advantages. Not only is it in sync with widespread leftish suspicions of Leninism, but it is relatively undemanding and unthreatening. It doesn't require social actors to alter their existing political identities, but only their cognitive diagnoses. I wonder, however, whether that reliance on cognitive as opposed to affective glue is also a weakness. Would such an address be strong enough to hold the bloc together, especially given the inevitability of pro-capitalist stratagems to divide and weaken it through a clever mix of enticing carrots and repressive sticks. A second possibility could afford some stronger glue, but would be a harder sell. The thought here is to address the same set of social forces just identified, but in a somewhat more unified way, as differently situated constituents of an expanded working class. That idea follows, too, from the expanded conception of capitalism I've proposed here, which discloses capital's structural reliance on domesticated and expropriated labor as well as on exploited labor. If accumulation requires all three types of labor, then all three types of workers comprise capitalism's working class, which also, of course, includes the very large number of people who perform work today of more than one type. Seen this way, the working class is constitutively gendered and racialized as well as inherently global. Unlike standard views of it, which center on majority ethnic men who work in factories or mines or construction, the expanded working class also includes people of color, women and migrants, housewives, peasants, and social service workers, those who receive a wage and those who don't. The advantage here is a political subject that can plausibly claim a measure of unity and generality while remaining internally differentiated and able to accommodate specificities. The effect might be to strengthen the solidary cohesion of an anti-capitalist counter-hegemonic bloc. But this approach, it must be admitted, is more demanding. It requires a cognitive cum affective leap beyond the current self-understandings of many people. Everything depends, I think, on our ability to develop a guiding perspective that neither simply celebrates nor brutally obliterates the differences among us. Contra-fashionable ideologies of multiplicity or difference, the various oppressions we suffer do not form an inchoate contingent plurality. Although each has its own distinctive forms and characteristics, all are rooted in and reinforced by one and the same social system. It is by naming that system capitalism and by joining together to fight it that we can best overcome the divisions among us that capital cultivates structurally. Divisions of race and gender, as well as those premised on what now appear as somewhat old, restrictive, and inadequate understandings of labor and class. But of course, we must understand capitalism in the right way. Contra narrow old school understandings, industrial wage labor is not the sum total of the working class, nor is its exploitation the apex of capitalist domination. To insist on its primacy is not to foster, but rather to weaken class solidarity. In reality, class solidarity is best advanced by reciprocal recognition of its internal differences and of the relative differences among the people who make it up, of their disparate structural situations, experiences, and sufferings, of their specific needs, desires, and demands, of the varied organizational forms through which they can best achieve voice. In this way, Du Bois plus one could conceivably overcome familiar stale oppositions between so-called identity politics and so-called class politics. But now we need to consider some obvious objections. Is Du Bois plus one labor reductionist, Does it exclude or downplay or treat as epiphenomenal or superstructural major concerns and aspects of the present crisis, such as global warming and de-democratization? And does it exclude or downplay or epiphenomenalize major forms of sexism, racism, and other oppressions that do not, on their face, appear to have much to do with labor? Let me begin with ecology, and let me explain why I believe the objection here is misplaced. The reason is that nature and labor are always already internally related. Nature is a condition of labor, which couldn't happen without it. Nature supplies the material substrate that labor transforms. It's the ultimate source of all the productive and reproductive inputs that labor requires. Labor presupposes the availability of energy to power effortful, need-oriented work, energy that includes human and animal muscle, which is fueled by digesting food that originates from biomass. It also includes so-called exosomatic energy, such as wind and water and coal and oil. Nature, as I said, also supplies material substrates, including raw materials for labor to transform, not just specific substances inputted directly into production, but also general environmental conditions for it, such as breathable air, potable water, fertile soil, relatively stable sea levels, a habitable climate. Finally, nature is the setting and site of laboring communities, their habitat and meaning-laden place of social interaction, their means of livelihood, the material basis of their social reproduction. All of this is what Marx had in mind when he called nature man's inorganic body. In general, then, we don't need to say that nature works too, as Jason W. Moore does, in order to establish its connection to labor. Nature and labor are already internally connected, conceptually and materially. Any movement or alliance that stands for the cause of nature must also be eco-political, committed to protecting and repairing non-human nature. That's another reason, by the way, why such a movement must be anti-capitalist. Just as capitalism is almost designed to instrumentalize and deform labor, so it is also designed to instrumentalize and deform nature. The system incentivizes capital to appropriate nature below cost, to help itself to yet a whole nother array of cheap inputs, while absolving capital of any and all obligation to replenish what it takes or repair what it damages. Virtually begging the capitalist class to fatten itself by guzzling natural wealth, capitalism is a veritable wrecking machine programmed to destroy the planet. In general, then, we don't need to worry that the project I'm proposing here loses the ecological problematic or marginalizes the eco-political aspects of anti-capitalist struggle. What about democracy? Doesn't that seem on its face unconnected to labor? Does Du Bois +1 exclude or marginalize this issue? I think not. In fact, there are deep connections here too between the two problematics. As Du Bois observed, capitalist society divides the economic from the political, assigning the organization of at least that work that it recognizes to the first, that is, to the economic realm, and assigning the governance of subjects to the second, political realm. The effect is to cede the power to organize work to capital and to remove it from the political agenda. That division between the political and economic is problematic on several grounds, as Du Bois realized, not least because it establishes the workplace as a dictatorship in which bosses command and workers obey, as Elizabeth Anderson has recently argued quite elegantly. No wonder, then, that the political-economic division has been robustly contested by a succession of labor movements. They understood that that division implants structural authoritarianism deep in capitalism, in capitalist society, even when that society congratulates itself for establishing liberal democracy. But merely democratizing work would not be sufficient to empower labor in all of its three phases. I mean, what would it mean, after all, to democratize degraded, racialized subwork, which is work that should not exist at all? And what would it mean to democratize gendered, domesticated care work, which should not exist, at least in that form? The larger problem here is the very design and division of work in capitalist society. The struggle to really empower labor must contemplate transforming that design. A key issue here, I think, is democratizing control over social surplus, by which I mean democratizing fundamental divisions about societal development. What, how much, and how to produce, on what social, ecological, and political basis, how to relate to non-human nature, to future generations, and to the legacies of past oppressions, whether to produce a surplus at all, and if so, how to allocate it, what role, if any, to give to markets and private property. All these matters are currently decided behind our backs in ways that ensure capital's health and threaten the health of labor. To empower labor, then, we need to treat them as public matters, just as we need to treat social surplus as collective wealth. These are among the among the central elements of an expanded view of what it means to empower labor in all its three phases. They are also central elements of what it means to realize democracy. Far from being extraneous or secondary, then, democratization is fundamental to Du Bois +1. On this point, too, I think the project escapes the charge of labor reductionism. Now, I've already said a great deal about questions of race in the previous two lectures, and I've said relatively less about problems of gender. So I'm going to concentrate here on the second, assuming that you can connect at least some of the dots between racialized subwork, marginalization, disrespect, and vulnerability to violence. Remember that in lecture 1, I said that race simply is the mark of violability. And I think that gives an indication of how broad the labor movement around expropriation can and should be understood, how it can encompasses many, if not absolutely all, of what anti-racist activists want to confront. But what about sexism? I want to say more about that here now. Does the labor focus obscure forms of sexism not related to labor? Does it downplay feminist concerns with sexuality, reproductive rights, gender violence, heterosexism, internal colonization? To answer this question, we should distinguish between those forms of sexism whose connections to labor are relatively direct and transparent on the one hand, and those forms whose connection, if any, are indirect and harder to see. After trying to uncover the latter, we can determine what, if anything, remains and is left out. In the first group, relatively transparent, I include reproductive rights, including abortion. These are labor issues and appear clearly as such as soon as we expand our understanding of labor to encompass reproduction and care work. Insofar as women do not control their embodied capacities to produce and reproduce, they lack a fundamental labor right. Absent their right, absent that right, reproductive labor is itself domesticated. It's revealing, of course, that abortion rights, right now on the chopping block in the United States, as we wait with bated breath to hear what the Supreme Court will do, it's revealing that abortion is generally not viewed this way, even by women themselves. That's a strong indication as how deeply the view of reproduction as non-work is entrenched in capitalist societies. Let's look also at another case that should be transparent but often isn't, namely the issues raised by Me Too. Those issues are directly connected to labor and should easily be recognized as such. What does Me Too target but gendered abuses of power, especially sexual harassment and sexual assault? Where does it focus on those abuses? But in the workplace, especially, although also in schools and universities, athletic organizations, and medical settings. These abuses are perpetrated by bosses, coaches, teachers, and doctors, whom exercise power over their subordinates, especially over those who fall under their direct supervisory power, typically, but not always, women. And even when they are not directed at women exclusively, they prevent women workers, students, and athletes from participating on a par with men in paid work, education, and sports. They thus constitute those arenas as dangerous spaces where women are still not fully entitled to be present and can only enter at their own risk. Again, the connection to labor here is or should be obvious, and yet it is not often made. One reason may be the media focus on stars, especially well-known entertainers, famous, privileged, highly paid. They are viewed as objects of celebrity gossip as opposed to labor activists or workers, which they nevertheless are. That media focus obscures not only their situation, but also something else, and that is the massive prevalence of workplace harassment and assault in less privileged settings, in homes, farms, migrant labor camps, sweatshops, private homes, I meant to say hotels first, private homes that employ au pairs and domestic workers, often migrants. In terms of sheer numbers, it is overwhelmingly poor and working class women, especially migrants and women of color, who suffer the abuses targeted by Me Too. Often engaged in subwork, including subwork that converges with care work. These workers still do not enjoy the full panoply of rights afforded to those who are merely exploitable. They are thus vulnerable and violable. Me Too is a labor movement by any generous reckoning. What about heterosexism, gender binarism, transphobia? Does the labor focus risk marginalizing or excluding these issues? And they certainly appear to be far removed from questions of labor. But even here, a little conceptual digging can reveal some connections. As I explained in Lecture 1, capitalist society relies on domesticated labor, unpaid or underpaid, and typically assigns it to women. It views that work as a simple expression of maternal feeling or feminine instinct, hence not as real social labor. Assumed to come naturally to women, care work is treated as a natural resource, simply there, available for the taking, infinitely self-regenerating, not in need of replenishment. Those who perform it or who should be performing it are constructed as hyper-affective, creatures of feeling, exquisitely sensitive to other needs, not so much concerned about their own. The work of reproduction, in other words, is the devalued other of the masculinized work that is called production. In general, then, I'm suggesting that the construction of labor in capitalist society implants gender binarism deep in the system's structure. This binarism affects everyone, women and men, cis and trans, gay, straight, and queer. In fact, it casts non-cis, non-straight, and non-binary people as anomalous outside the pale, which is why it takes so much effort for them to win recognition as legitimate members at all of capitalist society. So these concerns, too, are at least indirectly connected to the system of capitalist labor. Okay, at the start of these lectures 2 days ago, I posed some questions. Why make the concept of labor the starting point for thinking gender, race, and class? Isn't it tied to a perspective that prioritizes class over gender and race? And doesn't this risk reinstating the labor metaphysic and class reductionism that dominated social theory and political practice in the past? Won't an approach centered on labor lose the hard-won insights of feminists and anti-racists? Won't it take us back to the same discredited paradigm that we've worked so hard to dislodge? I said then, 2 days ago, and will repeat now, that the answer is no. Sometimes it's necessary to risk the appearance of going back in order to go forward. Certainly, the proliferation of identity-based social movements and intellectual paradigms associated with them delivered real insights, but it also encouraged separatism and siloization. The question we must ask now is whether we can meld those insights with one another and situate them in a broader frame, a frame that contains them all. Have feminists and anti-racists reached a level of political maturity that allows us to relinquish the defensive postures we've grown used to in favor of the sort of offensive postures that our times demand? Are traditional labor movements, reeling from the return of expropriation, finally now able to see that the fates of exploited workers are tied to the fates of the expropriated and domesticated? Can all of us grasp the severity and scale of the present crisis and rise to meet it by risking a broader engagement? Can we now make a reality of Du Bois's dream of an inclusive pro-working class front that embraces the concerns now of 3 labor movements and fosters their cooperation? I don't know the answer, to be sure, but I hope it is yes. And I hope that these reflections have contributed in some small way to clarifying what we must do to bring it about. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much for another illuminating lecture. Thank you so much for raising such important questions and for giving us inspiring and thought-provoking answers. And I'm sure that the Q&A will bring some of them up. The first one already.
Ja, ich werde die Frage in Deutsch stellen. Vielen Dank für die interessanten 3 Vorträge. Ich habe die alle 3 sehr interessiert verfolgt. Ich habe mich aber auch die ganze Zeit gefragt, ob Sie die Wertabspaltungstheorie von Roswitha Scholz kennen. Also eine in der Wertkritik entstandene feministische Theorie im außeruniversitären Kontext, die für mich genau das fasst, was Sie als plus one beschrieben haben. So I guess the theory I'm referring to is called in English critique of value dissociation. The question is if you know it. Thanks a lot.
Just basically, whether you are aware of, whether you know Roswitha Scholz value theory and how you would integrate it into your framework, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, I am aware of the whole value form paradigm. I've been was a very close interlocutor with Moishe Postone in particular, whom we greatly miss. But I mean, there's tremendous insight there. But I think I said this yesterday. The whole the introduction of expropriation and of domestication, in a sense, changes or resituates the value problematic, because it means that capital accumulation depends on much more than surplus value extracted from exploited workers, which is what that paradigm focuses on. I said yesterday that I think we ought to be talking a lot more about profit and a lot less about surplus value. It's not that there's anything wrong with the surplus value or with this value theoretic problematic, but there's more going on. And it is, and although the sort of the whole sphere of exchange, which is also important in that theory, gives rise to so-called commodity fetishism in various forms. I'm really insisting that there's a lot going on in capitalist society that is not directly commodified and not directly stamped by the value form, although it's causally affected by the importance of the value form. So what I mean by an expanded view of capitalism involves looking at the so-called hidden abodes behind the value abode, which have a different grammar of social practice. And this is partly why I insisted that we not take a view of class that is homogenizing, that is based on one conception of labor, one relation to accumulation. So it's great as far as it goes, but it needs to be resituated in this broader field. That's the best I can do.
Yeah, we're just taking turns between those two mics, so go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, first of all, for the very, very interesting lectures. I have a question, and I wrote it down to try to keep it short. Yeah, I have a question concerning, like, at least one potential way in which trade unions could fight against racist, imperialist, or sexist work practices. And as you maybe know, the trade union PCS, that represents border force officials in the UK, recently took legal action and also did a strike as a response to the government's proposal to force boats in the English Channel to turn back. And a few days ago, the head of PCS did a public statement emphasizing that PCS would protect their members from being forced to implement cruel and inhumane policies. And as the journalist Ash Sarkar noted, this is an interesting way to look at the role of trade unions, namely to say that when you demand workers to abuse others, it degrades and harms also the worker, and it therefore becomes the legal job of the union to protect its members of such social or psychological damage. Yeah, so my question is what your opinion is on such a strategy, and if you have heard of similar examples in other contexts, and also if you see any potential downsides to such an approach, since it essentially focuses on the well-being, on the workers implementing abusive policies rather than the people impacted by them. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think that I think it sounds great, and I'd like to see more of it. I certainly am not seeing any of it, or not on the scale of an actual labor union taking a public stance. There's nothing like that going on in the United States, as far as I know. There may be individual border agents or even individual policemen who, are opposing or even refusing to do the kind of repressive work that you're talking about. No, I mean, I'm still thinking back to the 60s, which I talked about, yesterday. I mean, we could go back to war and to soldiers that refused to carry out orders, and even to things like fragging, where they kill their superiors. This is obviously one tool, and a very exciting one, in what has to be a very big toolkit. But it sounds great.
Next one, please.
Hi, thank you for all three lectures. They were interesting. I wonder if there's one quite substantial claim that you've made, whether you could provide some more reasoning for it. I think it's quite clear that, as you've explained, in addition to merely exploited labor, there's also still under contemporary capitalism this expropriated labor. And I think you've already also provided sort of reasoning for why capitalists want to make use of this kind of labor, because it's simply cheaper and therefore more profitable. But you've made a claim which is somewhat more substantial than that, or goes further than that, which is that you think that expropriated labor is necessary for the successful accumulation of capital. And it seems to me that, as sort of Marx laid it out in Capital, exploitation should be sufficient for the accumulation of capital, because when workers produce more value than the value that they consume, then there is a surplus, and that therefore a source for profit. So isn't merely exploitation, at least logically, sufficient for the successful accumulation of capital? Thank you.
Thank you. Look, that's a deep and very well-posed question. And what I want to say is that I do think it's necessary. Now, how to actually make the argument is not so easy. But here's how I think about it. Just imagine if we were able to make an accounting of what capital destroys as it accumulates. What it gobbles up, what it spits out, what it leaves dead, dying at the human level, at the natural level, and so on. I mean, we're counting surplus. That's what I'm saying before about the value problematic. We're counting surplus in capital's terms. Let's count it in our own terms. I don't think this system produces a surplus at all if you actually line its productivity up against its destructivity. So, yeah, capital can rack up, well, they're not even getting Bitcoin anymore, it looks like, but it can rack up something. But in any non-perverse system of accounting, I think that it's as I said, it's a machine for vacuuming up wealth and trying to turn it into value. And anyway, you get the idea.
Would you go on?
Yeah, thank you for very illuminating lectures. I wonder whether it might be fruitful to rather use the term ethnic group instead of race, because I think it is broader, because it implies cultural perception and self-perception, language, religion, historical myth, and so on. And in cities like Berlin or in Western societies today, I think, the underpaid working class very much consists of ethnic minorities, which, frankly speaking, often do not like each other. So I think it might be interesting to see how this cultural dimension prevents solidarity, a broad solidarity, say, in the working class consisting of different, as you call, faces.
Right. Well, I mean, I've been told, and I can well understand that it might be true that the term race has a special problem to be used in Germany. And I understand why people might prefer to talk instead about ethnicity. But I'm not, when I talk about race, I'm not talking about actual, human groups that exist as distinct races. I hope that for the most part, I was careful enough to speak about racialized groups as opposed to racial groups. That's certainly what I intended to say. And that's a very different notion. If you say that the people who are mainly doing expropriated work here are ethnic groups, I presume you mean whatever it means, non-white European German descended people, then they are, pardon? Sorry?
White people, of course, I mean from Europe, but they have a different ethnic background. They are maybe from Eastern Europe, from Southern Europe, and so on. They're maybe Catholic Croats or Orthodox Serbs or whatever.
Right. I understand. And this is sort of a whole nother issue about who gets to be counted as white. And it has the East-West thing, this came up yesterday as well, is a whole nother question that the association of whiteness with Westernness. So I still believe that you can apply this notion of racialization, which means, for me, constructed as violable. Now, look, I don't know enough about the stuff that you're talking about, but I do know that in the history of the United States, Poles, Ukrainians, and so on were not immediately or accepted as white. Even Irish and Italians had to claw their way up into becoming white. So maybe something like that is going on here. This is less an issue of, as I say before, it's certainly not an issue of any actual human racial groups. But there's a wonderful article I want to recommend by Karen Brodkin called, what is it called? Something about global labor, what's race got to do with it, who really looks at this whole question of the division of labor, of skills within factories, and how various groups of workers strategize and work to try to move up toward whiteness. Anyway, this is the kind of background, work that I have in mind here. but I don't know enough about the German situation to say any more.
Okay. Next, please.
Hi. First of all, I'm thankful for the framework you provided. I think it gives us the tools to recognize our common oppression without negating the differences in it. And I will surely present it to my friends and to my audiences. But I wonder where we go from here, or where we go from there. I think to really put this into practice, we need a lot of conversations, and I wonder where those conversations will be held. Will it be enough to just talk about them in an informal way, or is there a need for some kind of institution or some kind of organization where those interests will be mediated? I think one of the strengths of the old labor movement was that it had those organizations, namely unions, of course, and social democracy. This, of course, reeks kind of tradition and so on, and I'm not sure if those are the places to have those conversations, but I think eventually they will have to be mediated somewhere. And the strength of the old labor movement was, of course, that they had a clear goal in mind. And this goal encompassed all these different kinds of, or should encompass all these different kinds of oppressions, and should kind of set a clear goal where we can all unite in the end. And I know a brave woman mentioned the party, I think on Tuesday, and you wanted to dodge this question, and I don't want to insist on it, but I still wonder how all those kind of movements as they are can unite. Okay, that's it.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think that what we think of as the left has a huge organizational problem today. Basically, it's kind of gone from the Leninist extreme to the, let 100 flowers bloom kind of extreme. And there's got to be something in between those, right? What exactly it is, I can't say. But I do think that we have seen the emergence in many places of political campaigns, either within, even like in the United States, even within the Democratic Party, the sort of Bernie Sanders wing of the party. You're seeing campaigns develop that are trying to speak to a very broad audience and who have not exactly what I've been saying in mind, but something that I recognize as, right, my kind of thing. So, these things are happening, and they're happening in a lot of different milieus. First of all, I don't know so much, again, about Germany, because I think your trade union movement has been less weakened in the United States and may still, therefore, have a more classical form. But for us, the old traditional unions have been decimated, and all of the labor organizing comes from new unions or unions that are transforming themselves by organizing the sorts of workers that they wouldn't have touched with a 10-foot pole before. So we have hotel workers, hospital aides. Staten Island just voted for a union at Amazon. Starbucks workers are unionizing. There's all kinds of stuff going on, and it's often led by young people, people of color, and women, who are the face of that, hybrid, expropriated, exploiting, precarious sector of the working class, which is very large. So that's one place where something like this is already happening, because those unions have to address issues of racism and issues of sexual harassment and assault and so on and so forth, and all the forms of disrespect that those workers suffer. You know, there are organizations that are not quite parties, but may be, you know, want to become parties, like Democratic Socialists of America. I don't know if they're ever going to become a party. Again, forgive me, I'm drawing on US examples, but those are the ones I know. You had, a lot of this was basically encouraged in the wake of Occupy, where we did get Podemos, you know, maybe fallen on somewhat hard times at the moment, but they tried to transform something else into a party, into a different kind of left party. You know, there's a lot happening, and I couldn't possibly articulate a scenario of how it would or should play out. But I'm sure unions and political parties will play an important role in it.
Okay, thanks.
Hello. I'm similarly very grateful for the framework that you've laid out today. My question concerns the relations, if you think there are any, between something like working off the past, which would be, I think, a much more specific and historically material and concrete sort of practice than the one that you've laid out here, and the kind of post-intersectional labor struggle that you've articulated. As you might guess, my question is coming to some extent from the American context and the controversy, if that's the right word, over the 1619 Project and the past, the national story that we tell in that country and so forth. Basically, I wanted to ask for a riff on the relations between this kind of reckoning with history, especially when it comes to race in American context anyway, but I think to some extent with colonial struggle in every country, and the kind of future-oriented solidarity movement that you have so usefully laid out today. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. I think it's quite important. And here I want to say that there's a sense in which Germany, for all of its problems, is a kind of model of, you know, of that kind of working through, at least in relation to the Holocaust. I don't know what's going on with communism now, but, by contrast, the United States until now has never fully owned and reckoned with its history of indigenous genocide and of the enslavement of Africans and their descendants. So we have a huge amount of work to do. It's important that this work, you know, be sort of be widely absorbed, so that people understand why they're in the situation that they're in and why others are in a different situation that they are in. There's got to be some framing that, you know, that makes this history, you know, part of people's self-understanding, because it is causally at work. The question is it going through people's heads as it materially and causally, right, affects them? And look, I have some quibbles with 1619 in particular, because I think it's actually got the history a bit wrong, but that's neither here nor there. The other point, though, is how to do this in a way that does not come off as liberal moralizing and guilt-tripping. Because this is where that backlash against it comes from. This is why, you know, conservatives, Republicans, and a huge number of people in the United States now are so upset that people are introducing something called critical race theory into the schools. For them, what that means is they are teaching our kids to believe that they and we, their parents, are racist. It doesn't mean that. Not in the sense that they think about it. Somehow it got to be done in a way that invites inclusion as opposed to moralizing, you're the bad guys. That's not easy. I don't know how you pull it off, but that is what I think part of this so-called controversy that you referred to is about.
So we have time for 2 more questions, I think. And could you, I don't see actually how many people are queuing still and who is queuing, but could you leave room for women to speak?
I would like to stress a bit a question that was somehow asked earlier, because I think that, or I accept what you told of this labor, these 3 forms of labor, expropriated, exploited, domesticated, sounds somehow like the ticket to enter the movement, the intersectional joint labor movement. And I was wondering how to address this majority of society, that gains sufficiently to live the average luxury, and that don't feels or has the feeling to have to change something. Yeah. Thank you.
That's a great question, and I mean, if that description holds for huge numbers of people, that they don't feel the need to change anything, that they have enough average luxury and are happy with the way things are, then I think that this project is dead in the water. Again, this might just be, an American thing. I mean, the devastation of our working class and much of our middle class is so palpable, and which is why people like Trump are so popular. I mean, I don't think there's a situation in many places where there's just a lot of people who are, just happy to continue. I think there's a widespread sense that we're at a real impasse, that something has to give, that we can't go on in the same old way. So in that situation, then the question is, which way do we go? And that depends on what narratives and ways of thinking and projects are on offer. Too many of the projects on offer are horrible. And I think, the left has been a little slow because of this fear of Leninism and so on to, try to offer something big that can address people. But you're right, if people are happy, then we are sunk.
So the last question, please.
Thank you, Professor.
This is going to be the quote of the day, I guess.
I'm quite nervous, so I'd like to apologize. And I would like to ask if the counter-hegemonic politics foresee another type of work, other cosmologies and ways to live beyond the hegemonic logic of such colonial power, as Aníbal Quijano said, and also as Lugoni said too. And maybe as a type of possible interactions non-based on accumulation, and I think that it's very similar to the solidarity that Professor said. And I'm asking it considering a second question that concerns the culturally differentiated group as indigenous people, for example, that are not exactly included in the labor frame, I think, unless because of the expropriation process, especially in Latin America, where I am from. So I am asking especially to think, where is the place of indigenous people, for example, and where is the place of this kind of work that doesn't it include in the frame of the hegemonic capitalism that arrived to us by a long time ago. So that's it. Thank you, Professor.
Thanks a lot. It's a really important question. Let me start with the very last part. Essentially, what you're talking about here are communities that are or have for a long time been engaged in subsistence labor of one form or another that is quite removed, apparently, from the world market and from the, and that capital has either so far not been that interested in, maybe that their land, it doesn't have lithium or something like that. So they're apparently, less connected, but of course, in reality, the whole world is overarched by the system, and there's no corner of it, however apparently remote, that isn't in some way constrained by it, marginalized by it, and so on, and that could at any moment, depending on what somebody decides is now, a possible input that they want, could at any moment be expropriated if they haven't already been. What happens to them after expropriation then depends, right? It's unlikely that they have the process that the European peasantry had of sort of being able eventually to become exploited factory workers. Maybe they are just sort of left without their own means of production, without, therefore, the ability to really survive, and they drift here or there. Maybe they, some of them at least, migrate to cities and become part of some sort of reserve army of labor or some gray, informal kind of expropriated sub-work, right? I don't know. But then there's the question that you raised about cosmology and ways of thinking. And here I think I want to say two things, that we definitely need new ways of thinking about how we relate to nature. That's for sure. The ones that this system has given us, as I said, are just a recipe for destruction. And there are many people who believe that they find in indigenous worldviews some, very promising and interesting conceptions. I think the most important thing, I wouldn't want to insist that the kind of coalition that I'm interested in building needs to sign on for everyone to one cosmology. I mean, there are all kinds of people who don't actually want really a spirit, anything that would count as a spiritual cosmology. I'm probably one of them. But I would maybe use some sort of a Rawlsian idea, an overlapping consensus of different non-destructive ways of thinking about nature. As long as we pull the emergency brake on the one that's driving us into the abyss, then, we can sort of think about it differently. That's the best I can do.
Thank you so much. Pulling the emergency brake actually is something that Walter Benjamin used to say. So please remain seated for a while. We have been talking so much about shadow work and about how everything that happens here in the foreground is made possible by people who have been working. So we will want to use the last couple of minutes in order to thank everyone who was involved in those wonderful 3 days. It is, of course, the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, from the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, Bernd Scherer. It has been Laura Mattes, Nadia Herrmann, who have been of so much help. I actually couldn't imagine a smoother way and a more professional way to operate here. So that was, actually of great help. And none of this would have happened without your work. There's also Oliver Stoll. Then, of course, and Nancy has already mentioned them, our interpreters who, they are really in the shadow here and who have done a wonderful job. Thank you so much, Lilian Astrid Gese, Silvia Schreiber, and Patricia Isomo, who is not here today. So really, you did a great job, and it was, it was really important for quite some people here in the audience that we got those interpretations. The technicians now.
Yeah, I'll continue with the technicians because of the handwriting, I studied it closely. So I want to thank Jörg Schulze, Gian Piero Tari, and Tobias Rüst from the Humboldt University Media Service. From the HKW, Simon Franzkowiak, Matthias Hartenberg, Tassos Papiomitoglu, Felix Potzwatowski, Felix Weck, Bastian Heide, Martin Greff, and the team of Busch and Dehn. They did the lighting, the sound, the stage, the doors, so everything that provides the physical and spatial infrastructure and atmosphere in this wonderful room. Well, and finally, we would like to ask the members of the team at the center to come on stage because they all did a lot of work in the weeks and months that led to this event this week. So I would like to ask Susanne Schmeisser, Marvin Isler, Jonathan Klein, Sveta. Mit dem Blumenstoff nochmal gleich, ne? Okay, so again, Susanne Schmeisser, Marvin Ester, Jonathan Klein, Louis Leary, Johanna Eckert, and Sveta Pauli. Thanks so much for all the massive work that you put into this event. Also thanks to Christian Schmidt and Barbara Heinrich, who can't be here tonight, unfortunately, for health reasons. They did also put a lot of work into this event. It's very sad that they can't be here with us. And well, a final and really great thanks to Nancy, of course, for all your work and for sharing it. Thank you so much.
So thank you, all of you, and thanks to the audience. We are looking forward, actually, to seeing you next year for the next Benjamin Lectures with Sally Hesslinger. Get home safely, and bye-bye.